Okay, so for this video, we're going to take a look at some tools that other people have developed for taking historical information about the medieval period, whether that's population demographics or the names of old-time trades and professions that are no longer in use, or if it's just the actual urban morphology and configuration of medieval cities. And these are all kind of useful topics for world building. And I also brought out this book, The Foundations of Early Modern Europe from 1460 to 1559, which was written by Eugene Rice. And I brought this out as a prop to show because this was actually my copy that I acquired in the early 1980s. It was probably the first truly academic work that I mobilized to help me write campaign settings for Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, I had read, sort of popular works geared more towards the general reader, less of a specialized academic work. Uh, Prior to and after that, those continued to be a lot inform how I wrote these worlds and settings and adventures and that sort of thing. But that brings up the point that some of these materials that we'll talk about in this first shorter video, I've seen reviewed online, and they were perhaps subjected to a little too much scrutiny. Pulling out little facts or figures here or there and say, well, that wasn't accurate for this period or this region, and that's going to be true because after all, these things are being developed as game supplements. These are not the kind of resources and references that you want to use to support your scholarly or academic papers. So don't use this as the works cited for your term paper, but do use it when you're writing an adventure for a tabletop role-playing game. All right, so since for this video what we're talking about is other people's finished products and tools, I don't want to get into the weeds on trying to describe exactly how to use each one. I just kind of want to go over them in brief. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is a PDF from Cumberland Games and Diversions, and it's licensed so that you can make the document available to other people as long as you don't modify it or pack it into another document sort of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and make a link to that available in the description of the video. So it's called Medieval Demographics Made Easy. It'll give you an idea of what kind of population densities you should find given a certain level of resources. A particularly rich, fecund area with lots of resources might have 120 people per square mile. A place without access to a lot of different resources, farming land's not that great. Maybe it's only 30 people per square mile. The idea of that these populations then are concentrated into things like villages, towns, cities. Big cities give you a kind of threshold size for each one of those ideas, whether village or town, city or big city, and then you can kind of adjust that as appropriate to your own setting. Also provide you an estimate of how many people can a square mile of land support. In this case, their estimation it's 180. I've seen other people critique that number after going through historic resources, especially in Europe. 180 is not a bad estimate. If you wanted to bump that down to only 150 people supported per year on a square mile of land, that would be fine. If you wanted to bump it up to 200 people per square mile of land supported per year, that would also be fine. They also give you kind of an estimate of how many castles there would be in a territory. They're estimating it by population, one every 50,000, saying that 75% of all castles would be in the civilized or settled areas, and that the other 25% would be wilderness border areas. I think the distribution of castles is fine. Going by population might be a little more difficult, but we'll get to that in the next document. Now, the most important part of this particular PDF is this idea of service values. So what we're going to get into here is a system, that's somewhat randomized. So you can, it's going to vary from town to town if you go through that, and of course you can always, set it manually. You don't have to go by what the random determination is, but at least that does give you a source of variation. But it's the idea of the service value that per individual in a given trade or occupation or providing a given service, they can serve a set number of people in a population. So let's go to the table real fast, and we have all these sort of self-explanatory medieval trades, the more commonly known ones. And take a look at the top of the left column there. We see shoemakers have a service value of 150, and the way to read that then is that a shoemaker in a village could serve a population of about 150 people. So if your village is 300 people and they're all getting their shoes in the town in which they live, then you probably need two shoemakers, and adjust that as needed, or take into account the distribution of different trades throughout the area. And that gets kind of useful because I'm going to show you a site here. This is the Medieval Londoners project from Fordham University, and as part of the project they have an occupations page which goes A through Z, providing you the names of the different medieval trades and professions that you might encounter in literature, or randomized tables like the one I've just shown you. And then give you an explanation of what those things actually were. Genealogists also use this information a lot, so I'll provide a link to this site. This is just one that I thought had a pretty good distribution. What they're doing is they're actually breaking down the old occupations available in this book, the Dictionary of Old Occupations, and so they go A through B, and they actually had just a substantial number and good distribution of the old occupations, trades, services. And so I'll include a link to their website, but there's a lot of others. Like I said, genealogists tend to use old documents as they're searching down family members that include such things as their trade, and that's one way to distinguish one John Smith from the other John Smith, is kind of figuring out what they did and tracking documentation that way. So just bring that out real fast so you get an idea of what you get there. The next kind of demographics document that we want to take a look at is Medieval Demographics in Brief by Daniel R. Collins. Just to point out, this gentleman is actually one half of the duo that runs the Wondering DM's YouTube channel, so we'll provide a link to them down below. And it was kind of useful in the sense that what they do is, they talk a little bit about the size of maps, or in terms of hexes, and just briefly let's mention that if you're using a 6-mile hex, then you've got about 30 square miles within the hex. If you're using a 24-mile hex, then you've got about 500 square miles in each hex. And so the way they're looking at nested maps here, as you can see, they use 4 levels: 100-mile hex, 24-mile hex, 6-mile hex, 1.5-mile hex. I think these 24-mile hexes and 6-mile hexes are pretty common. Generally, you'll be about a day's travel from hex to hex in a 24-mile hex, and you break it down to 4 hexes of travel per day in that way. But you can show things in greater detail if you're using the 6-mile hex. And the reason this is kind of important is that they're going to provide you, this is a document that's more narrow in scope or utility, I guess. They're just looking at kind of villages, but they're basing it then on the size of the territory. So we're saying that within a 6-mile hex, there are probably 3 villages. Within the 24-mile hex, there will be 50 villages. And this is actually taking the number of villages in a given area. They looked at populations in England during the medieval period. You can get around to the previous document that we looked at, kind of defaulted to medieval France, which was known to be relatively high population density. But still, England was a pretty high population density through the medieval period too. And this is a lot more villages than what you would typically find in a D&D product, or module, we'll say. And let's face it, a lot of that is because you don't want to keep throwing that time necessarily into having to develop 3 villages per hex around a town or a castle. Now it makes sense in the medieval period because they would all have different resources and assets available to them. There would be different people working different trades in those villages. The peasants or serfs would actually probably a lot of times, people say, well, they were tied to the land and they would have had to have gotten permission from the lord to travel abroad. They must never have traveled anywhere. Well, that's probably not true. Actually, they like I said, they only had access to so many services or occupations within their small village. They might need to go a village over or two villages over to visit the lord's mill, we'll say. So the lords would often get a cut, or got the proceeds from milled grain in their territory from this one mill under their control. So it was to their advantage to let the peasants from two villages over travel over to the mill periodically so that they could get their grains ground for their own consumption, because they would actually make a cut off of that milled grain that was brought there to their particular mill. Uh, this document also provides an estimate for castles. So what we're saying here is that we get about one castle per 100 square miles. We've already talked about like a 24-mile hex being about 500 square miles, so that would give you 5 castles per 24-mile hex. Now remember, these don't all have to be large shell keeps that contain a town within them. They can actually just be buildings that are constructed as fortifications to provide defense to the people that live in them. But and then we also find that for every 3 6-mile hexes, you probably get 1 castle. And again, that varies a lot by geographic location through different times, and given different attitudes towards the nature of defense, how you would provide defense for your citizens and your lords and that sort of thing. But these are fair estimates. Then we go to walled towns, and what we think here is that for every 36-mile hexes, you would find 1 walled town, and that translates out to then about 1 walled town for every 2 24-mile hexes. So here again, much like villages, cities are a lot more common in the landscape in medieval history than they are necessarily in gaming products. And that was really all I wanted to bring it. There's also some other kind of useful ways, breakdowns of how they came to these determinations in here. And then the last thing we'll kind of get into, and I'll provide a link to this document too, is this is taken from a university's Department of Town and Urban Planning. You can probably find similar things in architectural history courses and that sort of thing. This is just a nice PDF. It's got a lot of good notes in it. So like I said, I'll provide the link for it, but it goes through some of these medieval towns, and then we're looking at like what's the historic foundation of medieval towns. Well, here's a little bullet point breakdown of how towns came about, not necessarily the first towns, but how medieval towns started to thrive again, because there had certainly been urban locations before that. Give you an idea of what the average size of a particular town was. So if we have a medium-sized town is not over 50 hectares or about 124 acres, but there's many small-sized towns at 4 to 10 hectares or about 10 to 25 acres. Little notes about kind of conditions of these more densely settled areas. Also some notes about locations and orientations of cities. So a river city might have a linear shape to it and be built then along the banks of the river. So every parcel that has river frontage has a short, narrow kind of frontage on it, would be typically something you would find. They also note, though, that there are a greater variation in German areas as compared to Italy and France, because what became Italy and France and it had a lot more Roman settlements there, and so later cities were built on top of earlier Roman settlements, whereas there were fewer of them in what became Germany. So there's more novel variation in different kinds of towns. So there's also another article that you may find behind a paywall, or if you get like a JSTOR free membership, you can probably access it and at least read the article. It's The Morphology of Medieval German Towns by Robert E. Dickinson, and it goes through a number of different towns. So, you get basic shapes where the major buildings were, possible densities, roadways. It's not gonna tell you every little detail of each of these towns, but it gives you an idea of the different, morphologies, the shapes that are involved, and how a town comes about growing. Uh, and then there are just a lot of different German towns that you'll get diagrams of here. So, and then the last part is a distribution of where all those towns then were in that particular area. Just wanted to show that real fast. So back to our medieval cities document, give you an idea of how these different what are the different town plans that are just spontaneous or organic. So they grow up around, so and so happened to build the building here, the church was built over here, the Lord built his castle there, and things just came about because it was connecting up all those randomly assigned points. Or you might find more planned cities, kind of a form of growth. How do the roads come about? Whether they're sort of rib form, where it's just perpendicular roads growing off a main axis, or if it's parallel road systems that are later connected up in different ways, or the ellipse or spindle pattern, where you might have roads going around both sides of a hill, or maybe one road and then roads that went around different topographic terrain, and that they would kind of build out that way. You might also find a half spindle or half ellipse, and then the sort of classic grid pattern that probably a lot of people think of. And this document will also give you different ways that market shapes would grow, different things about the location, like I was talking about. If you might have a linear pattern to your city along a stream or river, that kind of thing. You might, if it was built on the side of a hill or at the nose of a slope, you might find it, how the roads would be arranged, and, sort of showing them that they're going along the contour line of a particular hill. And you'll also find examples of other cities here. So then, aside from the plan, then we have the network plan, which is, we're talking about before, how the randomly assigned ones would be just, a building here, building there, because, so and so liked the scenery from that point, or that was a beautiful way to construct the landscape. Well, in the network plan, then as it grows, then we start connecting up nodes. So the major roads are connecting those big nodes. And we might find triangular plans, sort of like that semi-spindle shape we saw. And those might be, things back into a valley, for example, with a wall at the mouth of the valley that would create sort of a triangular shape. And then you might find combinations of the previous three. Probably, triangular would generally fit into a landscape rather than be planned for. And then the kind of natural, just things are placed where they make the most sense because you're planning to build in that territory no matter what, or because, again, there was a historic settlement there. So if a medieval settlement grows up where there had been a Roman settlement, that would be an example of that. And then lastly is also talks about some of the things you might find in the elements of the medieval city, which here we're talking about, residential houses, marketplaces, civic buildings, defensive structures, and then the streets themselves as part of one of the structuring elements of the town. Well, that's probably enough for the kind of villages and towns elements to get you started. Just the last note, I hope you'll forgive my playing around with the thumbnail and title a little bit. Originally, I was actually going to do it on the April Fool's Day. It just didn't get around to finishing the video, but it's mostly a joke. I'm not going to start feeding into the things that are said to attract YouTube's algorithm. Like I said, but I'm also I wanted to cover it up with the April Fool's Day idea, but I genuinely do kind of wanted to test out different things of how how the YouTube algorithm picks things up. So I'm just trying it out. Here again, I want to mention for anybody who might be the first time they viewed something from the channel, or to reassure any previous viewers, that's not going to be my shtick going forward. I respect my audience; doesn't need a lot of gimmicks to pay attention. So I just wanted to try it out to see how the algorithm picks it up. And anyway, I thank you guys for watching this video, and I hope to see you again at the next one.